Shabbat Shalom. Parashat Vaera. We are continuing the great saga of Moshe being sent to free Am Yisrael from Mitzrayim. In fact, Parashat Vaera starts off in the midst of a conversation, a rather unpleasant and harsh conversation. Moshe starts his mission, which we clearly know he was far from eager to do. And he goes to Paro, speaks to the Jewish people, and thinks everything is going to go smoothly, but instead, Paro makes the situation very difficult. Am Yisrael now is suffering. They no longer get hay, they have to work much harder. And they're angry at Moshe. And Moshe leaves Paro's palace and turns to God, and in language that is unprecedented in talking to God says, "Why did you send me? Since you sent me, you only have made things worse. What is going on?" And Kadosh Baruch Hu says to him, "You shall now see what I shall do to Paro, and how he will indeed send the Jewish people." But we start off our parsha with a monologue in which God tries to explain to Moshe fundamental principles about the way that he rules this world and the way that Moshe Rabbeinu is required to lead our people. A very strange sentence starts off a parasha. Vayadaber Elohim el Moshe, Vayomer elav, Ani Adonai. Vaera el Avraham, el Yitzchak ve'el Yaakov, be'el Shaddai. Ushmi Adonai, lo nodati lahem. And the Torah continues, in which Kadosh Baruch Hu promises Moshe that he intends to hold up the covenant. He hears the cries of the Jewish people, and he fully intends to save them and take them out of Egypt and lead them to Eretz Yisrael. Mentioning the 4 lashonot of Geula, the 4 languages of redemption that we're so familiar with from the Seder night. But what is the meaning of the beginning of the Torah, of the parasha? What does that mean when God says to Moshe, "I am God. I did not reveal myself to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov with the name God"? Well, this formulation of the name God, Yud Ke Vav Ke, is mentioned throughout Sefer Bereshit many times. The Avot commonly had that name used with them, so what is the meaning of this? To properly understand this, we need to first explain a very difficult statement by Chazal that really was mentioned in last week's parsha. In that moment when Moshe Rabbeinu stood by the burning bush, and God revealed himself to him and tells him, "Moshe, I have a mission for you. You are going to go to Egypt and save the Jewish people." So the Torah tells us in several ways how difficult this mission was for Moshe and how he really did not want it. He very specifically says, "I'm not for the job, send someone else." It's not until God gets angry at him and tells him to go on the mission and tells him that he will meet Aaron a long way that Moshe acquiesces and goes to do his job. And even when he finally does do it, he still complains time and time again, saying, "I'm an aral sfatayim. I have difficulty speaking. This is not the job for me." Well, how long did this discussion actually take? In our understanding of the storyline, the way it appears, how long was Moshe standing by the burning bush? Comes the Gemara and says to us an amazing thing. This conversation took no less than 7 days. Could you imagine? 7 days standing and arguing with God? What was Moshe arguing about? Okay, I don't want to go. Okay, I don't think I'm good for the job. What was the essence of the discussion? Well, it would take much longer than the format that we have available for us to explain this in full depth. But I would like to give a direction that is fundamental for understanding the entire storyline and will help us understand many interesting, serious questions. I believe that Moshe Rabbeinu was given 3 distinct missions to fulfill, and he had difficulties with each and every one of them. The first is the obvious. Take the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim. But in order to accomplish that, his mission was to get the Jewish people to the state of mind in which they are ready to leave Mitzrayim. He needed to elevate them from the depth of the idolatry of Mitzrayim all the way up to be a free nation that is ready and able to receive the Torah. This was a great mission. Mission number 2. Present God to Egypt. Paro was, in the first place, set up in such a way in which he would not be able to let the Jewish people go. The mission here was to get Paro and all of Egypt to see and recognize the great hand of God by systematically dismantling every component of the Egyptian idolatry. The Egyptian theology crumbled before their eyes. Mission 3, perhaps the greatest mission for Moshe Rabbeinu, or the most difficult one. Moshe had to elevate himself from being a shepherd to truly being the shepherd of the Jewish people. For that, there was a lot that he needed to learn. So here's a curious question for you. How many times does Moshe Rabbeinu actually ask Paro to allow the Jewish people to leave Egypt? How many times does Moshe Rabbeinu ask to free the Jews from slavery? I challenge you to find it even one single time. There is not a single time in which that request is presented to Paro. The request is always very consistent. Let us go for 3 days into the desert to worship our God. If the point was to take Egypt out and the Jews out of Egypt in a strong hand, if this was to show the glory of God, Moshe had a very good argument in front of God. You want him out? Take him out. What do you want from me? You want the Jewish people out of Egypt? Snap your fingers. Do whatever magic trick you need to do, and boom, the Jews will be out. You want to pay Egypt for their behavior? What's the problem? We don't need 10 plagues. 1 good plague wipes them out. Finished. But indeed, if we carefully examine the 3 missions before Moshe, we will see that that could not have been the process, because the Jewish people weren't ready. After 200 years of slavery, they were far from being ready to accept and understand being led under a true God. They were too familiar with Egyptian idolatry. They needed to eradicate all of these ideas from their heads. They needed to grow as a people, to become ready to be free, to become ready so they could truly enslave themselves to God. This was a very difficult and awesome task. And Moshe Rabbeinu was not only sure that he was up for the task, he wasn't even sure that the Jewish people were worthy. And thus God needs to explain to him, Moshe, you're missing a very important point. The Jewish people are being taken out of Egypt because of a covenant, because of a promise that I promised the forefathers. But you should know, Moshe, that the forefathers only knew God as a God of judgment. Yes, the word Yud-Kei Vav-Kei appears many times, but we are taught by Chazal that that has many different meanings. The difference between Elokim and Hashem means God of nature, God of miracle, the general public name, the definition of godliness, to the private name, but it also means the God of judgment versus the God of mercy. In fact, if you carefully examine the relationship of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov with God, you will never find either one of them appealing to the mercy of God. This was a notion that was unfamiliar to them. They only knew God as the God of judgment. Even in the argument that Abraham presents to save the people of Sodom, he argues a judicial argument, never asking for mercy. Says God to Moshe, you need to become familiar with another face of God. You need to become familiar with the face of mercy, because this is what the Jewish people need now. And when you become familiar with this, you will understand that the great task before you is attainable, because you will grow as a leader and you will learn how important it is to evoke the mercy of God onto His people. This becomes a pivotal issue after the giving of the Torah during the saga of the golden calf. We will address this with God's help in the future. But pay careful attention as the parasha unfolds, and notice how each one of these three tasks are standing before Moshe, and he struggles to try to attain them. He does a fairly masterful job in the relationship with Paro, in breaking down Egyptian theology. He does a fairly masterful job in slowly allowing the Jewish people to grow. The formation of Moshe as a leader, that took its time. This was the greatest task of all for him. And each one of these tasks slowly move along as the Jewish people stand ready to step out of Egypt onto the history of the world as Am Yisrael takes its place in destiny. Shabbat Shalom.